Hello, everybody. So we're going to start up now. And if anybody has any problems hearing, those of you that are virtual, let us know. You give this to me. We need to, oh, you got it.
Yeah,
Yeah, let's keep passing it out. What we're doing right now is downloading the NeuroGuide and the various parts of um, this workshop that you'll be seeing. And for now, I would like people to go around the room and introduce themselves. So let me see if I got my. So Emily, why don't you begin with introducing yourself, and we'll go around this way.
Okay, very good. Dr. Emily Colombo-Hetty, I'm Director of Rehabilitation at Florida Surgery Consultants Brain Lab.
Okay, have you been doing neurofeedback or?
Yeah, so I joined the practice I'm at currently 6 months ago, and they focus heavily on QEEG guided TMS and then neurofeedback as well. But I first did QEEG in 2017 when I worked in the RCT for auditory neurofeedback and autism.
Oh, well, very, very good. And we are currently working on RTMS. We presented this in Los Angeles. Ernesto is in France, and he's writing code to integrate it with the NeuroNavigator. So essentially, you can, we have a method that's actually better than what's done now. You just kind of, I did this at National Institutes of Health. You stimulate magnetically with the coil until your thumb starts twitching. Yeah, and that's this beginning part. But everybody's, if it's depression, you got to go forward up to Bravin area 10 and 8, et cetera, from the motor cortex. So you don't know where that is. And so you guess at it. You move this around and you're guessing. So Ernesto's got a way using the NeuroNavigator so we can see the MRI. We use the person's actual MRI. And we can then simulate exactly where the gyri are for the target area for the TMS. And so it combines the NeuroNavigator with the coil to determine where to place it. And it gives much higher accuracy, and it's much less expensive than doing like one person, I guess it was Werner, suggested doing functional MRI. And, it's a $3 million magnet. It weighs, 5 tons, not portable, and it's not fun, and it's expensive. So we now have a method just to move it around and to
I have the demo here that I can always show during the break.
Yeah,
I have the demo with
I don't know what the demo is,
the
but
demo of the e-field.
you got a demo. Anyway, I have the talk that Ernesto gave in California.
Remember? Yeah, in California, he gave us a demo software.
Yeah,
I have it.
yeah,
I can show it.
you can show it. But I'm also going to show his video because you'll see much more detail than what it'll be on the demo. But it's all right, Bill. What's your?
Hi, I'm Bill Lambos. I'm a neuropsychologist and owner of ABF Behavioral Health in Tampa. I'm a long-term colleague and mentee of Dr. Thatcher, my good friend Bob, many years. I'm here to stay current, to tune in, and I'm assisting ANI as requested with the affiliates program. And I'm sure Dr. Packer will say something about that later as we go.
Yeah, I will. I'll say it now. The affiliates program is something that Bill and I have been working on for a long time, and we got interrupted by it. But what it is a group of people who are working together as a team in different parts of the United States and different parts of the world, both international and so it's national. And we at Applied Neuroscience forms the hub of the affiliates. We have really important people like Bill Lambos, Richard Abbey, the neuropsychologist, Anthony Silver, essentially a neuropsychologist, Wes Center, and Joel Lubar, and then ourselves in the United States. And then we have a variety of people in Europe and in Japan, and maybe possibly, in South and Central America, but they probably, that's the James Roy. They have a location in London, so they'll probably be doing their workshops there. But the idea is to try to train people, educate them, and do it in a larger scale than we have before. So why don't you introduce yourself and
Sure. Hi, my name is Craig Tonio. I'm a medical internist. I've been working with Bill Lambos the last year and a half, and just getting mentored on NeuroGuide. Our practice, we do a lot of brain health really in two different segments. One is people who really have complex chronic conditions, Lyme, mold, long COVID now. The other is neurodegenerative disorders. And we're just about to start a study with Dr. Dale Bredesen on reversing cognitive decline. We're going to use NeuroGuide in our patients to just sort of monitor progress, sort of every couple of months. The initial pilot for the precision medicine study, 80% of the people with cognitive decline actually improve their scores. The MoCA improved by 5 points. And this now will have a control. And so we're hoping to really kind of move the needle in the unwilling to move neurology section. We certainly talked about that last night. But we're trying to build QEEG guided modalities. And so at our center, we now have hyperbarics and light and doing neurofeedback. We'd love to add RTMS over time and some stimulation, but just kind of doing that thing at a time here. And just have been very impressed about what, I don't understand why people wouldn't use the QEEG more, because it's just, for me, it was like just having, okay, this is the pocket ultrasound for the brain. Why wouldn't you want to know what's going on in a very inexpensive way? And it's been great to sort of see progress with patients. And since I've been using it, it's really kind of revolutionized how we sort of practice in terms of just not just guiding what's happening with neurofeedback, but guiding what we're doing with some of the nutritional lifestyle modalities and track progress. That's been great. I'm excited to learn today. And
Well, that's
I'll be here
great.
Today in person, and then tomorrow I'll be joining on the go. Gotta get back to myself.
you're going to go back tomorrow?
Yeah, I need to.
Okay. Just so everybody knows, tomorrow we will have hands-on. It'll be more practical than today. Today we'll be going over some of the science and to the foundations, but also you want to create a folder and put that on there. That's the workshop.
Okay.
It has NeuroGuide too, the latest NeuroGuide, in case you don't have the latest NeuroGuide. And it has all my PowerPoint and the various things I'll be presenting today. And that will be available for people who are virtual too at the end of this. But anyway, that's good to hear that you are working in those areas. We've been developing NeuroGuide in conjunction with both medical doctors, clinical psychologists, neuropsychologists, and lately even now neurologists, because the American Academy of Neurology was opposed to using the computers, the QEEG, until about the year 2020, and then they removed from the website all these warnings about using computers to analyze the EEG. And so now more people and more neurologists will be using it, which is good. But they have to be trained because they're so used to just looking at squiggles. And actually what they usually do, they just refer their patients to a specialist who only just looks at the squiggles. And then they work on neuropathies and the various other things that are neurologically useful to them. But that's a universe that's going to be expanding. Esther, what's up?
My name is Esther Mizrahi. I'm a neuropsychologist who specializes in QEEG for a traumatic brain injury clinic in Fort Lauderdale, Radius TBI, which is a comprehensive clinic that has various specialists to treat all sorts of brain injuries.
That's good. Very nice. And TBI is something that we'll be discussing here. We have one of the largest databases for traumatic brain injury from mild, moderate and severe. I worked at the University of Maryland shock trauma for 10 years. And that's in those days, QEG was accepted and the insurance companies reimbursed for it. And there was a tension between the neurosurgeons and the neurologists. The neurologists did not want to use quantitative EEG, but the neurosurgeons did. And so they came to me. I was in the Department of Psychiatry and said, could you set up a system for us neurosurgeons? Because we're dealing with people, every day, mild, moderate, and severe traumatic brain injury. And so we built a system actually that was a portable one that is on wheels, and you can move from bedside to from one place to another. And we did that for 10 years, about 10 years, and it was profitable. They actually the insurance companies reimbursed. In 1997, Mark Newer, who was opposed to quantitative EEG, wrote a position paper for the American Academy of Neurology, and he's the sole author. And he condemned the use of computers. And as a consequence, immediately insurance companies stopped reimbursing very, very quickly. And we're stuck with that today. But before 1997, they were reimbursing for quantitative EEG all the time. And we also did far-field both potentials, both somatosensory and auditory, and then visual, auditory, and somatosensory regular cortical potentials, because you want to look at the integrity of these pathways with people who have been injured. And so all of that was the standard of care, and they were billing for at least $1,500 for that complete workup on every patient. And so they were very happy with it. The neurologists weren't, but that was a problem between neurosurgery and neurology, not me. And so we were happy to do that. I then went to the National Institutes of Health and worked there for about 3 or 4 years. And they carried on that program after I left, but then when Newer came in and ended it.
Checking to see if you're recording.
Yeah, I should be.
You
Yeah,
should be.
it is. I did. I turned it on. Anyway, so that was the history, and it's unfortunate because quantitative EEG it was very well embraced at the National Institutes of Health, and we got I'll be showing you some analyses, but it was a standard of care, and I was a project manager for the first 128 channel EEG at the National Institutes of Health, and it was fully supported by everybody except the head of the neurology department. But the head of the National Institutes of Mental Health was very positive about that. And I'll be showing, but I have a book. I don't have it here. Maybe I'll bring it in tomorrow. That I published in 1994, 1995, 2 books, fully embraced by everybody at the National Institutes of Health. So it was a very positive experience. Why don't you let us know your background?
My name is David Bedinger, and I'm a chiropractor. I'm brand new to this I don't have the machine I'm not using, but I was searching, our clinic was searching for the ways how to approach the MTBI.
Mhm.
And, I found you guys and to learn and see how I can use it in the practice. Because we started using this machine, like I said yesterday, about Archaeologica, which is a pre-test for possible concussion. So, and this is an additional tool. Also, from what I understand, you can not only diagnose, but you can use a form of treatment too. So I'm just
Yeah.
eager to learn and see
Yeah.
how it can implement.
Well, that's great. Traumatic brain injury. In addition to the University of Maryland, when I left NIH, I got a position at the Bay Pines VA Medical Center, which is not very far from here, and to head up the traumatic brain injury program that they have. Again, this is before Mark Newer destroyed QEG, but and TBI. Well, I thought let people see who's here.
Oh, okay.
See, this is who's are virtual, and this is the people here. I just thought it would be a good way for everybody to get to know who's here, if they can see it. Anyway, so then at the Bay Pines VA Medical Center here, there was the Department of Defense and Veterans Head Injury Program that put together really headed up by Dr. Salazar, who was at Walter Reed. And so we measured EEG, MRIs, and neuropsych evaluations in over 1,000 subjects from 4 VA medical centers, Tampa, Minneapolis, Stanford, and I think in Tampa. And then we also did 3 military bases. So one was in San Antonio, Texas for the Air Force, San Diego for the Navy, and Walter Reed for the military. And so I coordinated all of that for almost for over 10 years. And we collected a lot of data. And we used that in NeuroGuide. So NeuroGuide has a very large database when it comes to traumatic brain injury, a lot of experience. And rapid acceleration, deceleration, we developed, we'll be going through it, the coherence and phase measures for effective and functional connectivity. That's really what's affected by traumatic brain injury. And then the more severe it is, your brain sits on a bony vault. And so you'll get with injury to the orbital frontal lobes and the temporal lobes. That's because it's sitting right there. So you can see that contusion to the gray matter. But what's really important are the rotation forces and the shear forces. And you can only measure that with quantitative EEG. And you can't use independent complements analysis. We'll be going through that too, because it obliterates your ability to actually measure functional and effective connectivity. And there's no reason to use it. We'll be going through how to artifact using NeuroGuide, and you can eliminate artifact in just a few, in less than a minute with high retest reliability. And I'll be going through that. So go ahead and let us know what is up.
I'm Drew Pearson, doctor out in San Diego now, and I've been doing this since '96. I think I got involved with NeuroGuide in 2011, and it's been the biggest boon for my practice and what I've done. And welcome to the tribe. You won't look back. I'll tell you that. Okay. Everything else will be like, yeah, well, we can look at that, but here's what we're going to do. But this is how fast you do it.
So you talk about the recovery portion,
Right?
but the diagnostic, so it's very specific.
It's very specific. Yeah, and it'll uncover things as you go along too. It's not everything's apparent initially.
Correct. So you retest
Yes,
and then you see.
retest.
Okay.
It's it's very dynamic. So it's, and I do a lot of integrated medicine. So everything from, CVAC, sick leave variable, altitude, hyperbarics, acupuncture, PMF, transcranial, neuroelectrics, and integrate that all into mostly a performance package is what I work with now for a lot of CEOs.
Well, very good. Make sure everybody can see this. If anybody has problems seeing what we have up here, let me know. But I want to briefly go through this as an introduction so you can kind of get started on where we're going as a background. I'm also going to be showing some videos from the Society for Brain Mapping and Therapeutics that we were at in Los Angeles 2 weeks ago. And so I can share that cutting edge science and not spend too much time on this, although the emphasis is with Brodmann, Corbian Brodmann, got a picture of him there. He was in 1909, 1906 and 1909, around there, did autopsy evaluation of brains of people who had passed away. And he did hundreds of them. And as he looked at the brain, and he looked at the brain under a microscope, he could see that there's different cytoarchitecture in different parts of the brain. And in the upper left here is actually from Brodmann's book. And he saw that there was different arrangement of neurons, different types of neurons, different density neurons. And in those days, this is coming out of the Darwinian period, where structure and function were known to be linked. And he reasoned that since there's different structure for these different parts of the brain, and he found 44 unique cytoarchitectural parts of the brain on the left, 44 on the right. But because the cytoarchitecture and the arrangement of the cells were different in each of these locations, he assumed there must be different function, because that's the way it was with Darwinianism. Birds with long bills who were able to get ants. Why do they have that long bill? Different animals have different adaptations. And so he argued and reasoned that these areas here have different functions. You can see the visual cortex, it had different, problem area 17, 18, 19, they had different cytoarchitecture. So he figured it must be different function. The temporal lobes for auditory information processing is different than the somatosensory cortex, etc. And that is summarized today. Essentially what happened at the National Institutes of Health, the $2 billion for the Human Brain Project went into the National Institutes of Health in 1990. And that immediately gave rise, there are already a bunch of PET scanners there, but that just expanded the number of PET scanners, the number of MRI machines, et cetera. And we immediately kept seeing, as people did different tasks, different parts of the brain would light up in the PET scanner or the SPECT scanner. And so since different areas would light up with different tasks, Peter Fox, who was at Johns Hopkins at the time, he came and he said, listen, there's an atlas, I call it Taleric Atlas in France, that he's using that allows us to link the Brodmann areas to the PET scan and the SPECT scan. And so, we had discussions. There was another competing atlas. One of the problems with what happened with Taleric Atlas is that was developed by Taleric and Trousseau, is his name, I think, in France, from a 55-year-old female who stepped through an elevator shaft, and she was an alcoholic too, apparently, and died. And but her brain wasn't hurt. I guess fell on her feet, but so they removed her brain And they started creating an atlas that's universal. Essentially what it is, you take any brain and put it into a box, a rectangle. And we have landmarks in our brain that they used. It was the crossing fibers in the posterior and anterior of the corpus callosum. And so there's commissures they're called. And they anchored the brain to those landmarks. And it allowed them to, when they put the brain into a box, into a rectangle, to draw a line between those two landmarks, the posterior and anterior commissures. And then no matter what the size of the brain is, all brains have these landmarks. So a baby brain to an adult brain, they would be able to get a coordinate system so that they could look at, you got X, Y, and Z, and you got negative and positive X, Y, and Z. And so they created an atlas that became universal. And after a lot of discussion, NIH, we decided to adopt that atlas, Telerik Atlas, and then Montreal Neurological Institute created their own, but it's the same, essentially has a linear transform between the two. But they got millions of dollars from NIH. They wanted to emphasize other things, but it just as good. So the NeuroGuide uses both the Montreal or the Telerik. You can, we got choose which one you want. But you can see here the different Brodmann areas that were then tested in PET scanners, MEG, EEG, SPECT, diffuse tensor imaging, FMR, functional MRI, et cetera, at the Human Brain Project, the National Institutes of Health. And all of these areas, which are cytoarchitecturally different, have different sources too. We can see these sources through the EEG, and the PET scan would light up. If you do a math problem, you would see it would be different than a visual problem, et cetera. And so all of that is well established. There's hundreds of papers published on using the Telerik Atlas and the Brodmann areas. And now what NeuroGuide does is we look at, because the resolution of the EEG for a source is 1 centimeter to 2 centimeters roughly. So we take the central voxel of each of these Brodmann areas and just look at it. It's representative of, because all the cells are the same, like Brodmann area 7 is centimeters, it's big. But all the neurons in Brodmann area 7 are cytoarchitecturally identical. So if you sample from one, you know that all the others are doing, basically. And then it allows us to see how Brodmann area 7 communicates with Brodmann area 19 or 18 or 17. So you can see through coherence, the time differences, which phase differences, and the phase slope index, which is the magnitude of information flow between all of these Brodmann areas. One of the interesting things that happened at NIH is that every time people did a study in the PET scanner, the cerebellum would light up for everything. And people were amazed by this. What's going on here? Because everybody at that time thought the cerebellum was just involved in balance, But it has 80 billion neurons. The cortex is 100. And it's 1/10 the size of the cortex. It's a very, very important part of our brain. And so we have incorporated the cerebellum in the NeuroGuide too. So you can look at the cerebellum, you can look at the vermis, which is, and I'll be going through this, but you'll be able to see that's the part that's very important for chiropractic evaluation, for balance. And then we'll see in a minute what goes on there. But at NIH, it's hard to see this one, but this is one of the books that we created, and that was in 1994. It has many chapters. It has, I think, 10 chapters just on quantitative EEG. Because those days, quantitative EEG was accepted at NIH. It wasn't only the neurologists didn't like it, but everybody else liked quantitative EEG. And MEG. And we compared magnetic encephalography to quantitative to EEG. And the problem with, at NIH, for example, first of all, it's 1,800 times weaker than electricity, magnetism is. And the way magnetism is created, and those of you that took a physics course, When electricity starts to flow, then magnetism is just a little bit later, actually the speed of light later, moves at right angles to the, so imagine a sine wave, and then magnetism is flipped 90 degrees, and it is trailing behind the electricity. That's the way magnetism and electricity go. You need electricity to make magnetism, but it's very weak. And so at NIH, they have a big shielded room in the basement at the National Institutes of Health. In those days, they just had a 10 or 12 channel magnetometer system. But as you go into the basement there, it's a big shielded room in the basement. On the wall is a train schedule. I remember I went in there and I said, why is the train schedule here? He says, well, we can't run any experiments when the subway goes by. It's a mile away. And as soon as the subway goes by, it just the magnetic field by the track of the wheels on the metal track creates huge magnetic fields. So that's the difference. The MEG cost those days about $3 million, and you had to use liquid helium and a shielded room. So compare that to a $4,000 amplifier that you can get no problem with the trains going by. But we got that in this book. We got all that information. And the second one too is that was in developmental neural imaging. And we'll be spending time today on looking at the sources, which is very important for us to be able to do, because the source analysis was developed really in the late 1800s by von Helmholtz. And he discovered, first of all, it's called the forward solution. If you have a source of electricity somewhere, like imagine a sphere or a balloon filled with saline and has sensors around the outside of the balloon, and you have a battery inside there. If you turn the battery on, then the electrical field, if you have sensors around the balloon, at the speed of light, you will detect the voltage when that battery goes on. And that's called volume conduction, okay? So anywhere, any source in a volume that goes on, but it's at the speed of light. Okay? If it's delayed by milliseconds, like the EEG phase and coherence, then that's not volume conduction, okay? It's gotta be near the speed of light. And in any case, then von Helmholtz said, what about if we don't know where the battery is? All we got is the sensors at the surface. Can we figure out, using what's called the inverse solution, where the source is? And so he did that. He was able to figure out where it is, because if imagine a balloon filled with saline and sensors and you got a battery, you can, as you rotate the battery, it's positive and negative, and you get near the surface and the potential gets really big, and the other side of the balloon, it's small, and you get the positive, negative side of the battery, and you'll see all of that. That's called the forward solution. And that's 100% determined in physics. But if you don't know where the battery is, you have to use this method. And you can see here in the lower left is a single dipole that you move around until you can account for the potential at the surface. And that's used today, we did at 128 channels, 256 channels at NIH for epilepsy. All you need is one dipole, maybe two dipoles. And you move it around until you account for the epileptic focus. It's still just 1 centimeter, 2 centimeter spatial resolution, though, even with 256 electrodes. The second method is on the lower right. It's called the multiple dipole method, and it's also called the distributed dipole method. The one on the left is a direct dipole method. So the distributed dipole method was developed in the late 1800s and is used also even today to evaluate earthquakes, sources of earthquakes, the detonation of nuclear devices, stuff like that. Back in the physics of and earthquakes, because I mentioned. Then cardiologists began to use it to evaluate the sources of the heart rhythm by putting an array of sensors around the chest. And so in the 1970s, it started being developed for the EEG. And by the late 1980s, this distributed method now became very, a bunch of different methods were evolved. And one of my jobs, I was on the team, is to evaluate the accuracy and efficacy of these different inverse, the multiple distributed inverse solutions. And we would do that, with knowing where the sources were, particularly epileptic sources, for example, and but a variety of different, both potentials, stuff like this. And the way it's done is what's called the lead field, and that was what von Helmholtz developed. That's shown in the upper part here, and basically that's a sphere, and we used in those days initially spherical head models, in which if you know the conductivity of the skull, the scalp, and the brain, which is in the upper left here, and you know that the distance between, you have sensors on the surface, and these three lines here in this volume, if you know what that angle is, then you can calculate what the source is. That's the inverse solution. And the way it's done is once you're measuring J as the current from the scalp surface, and then you move K, which is the lead field, beneath E. So J equals E divided by K, where E is the electrical potentials. It's a surface, so it's 2 dimensions. The lead field is 3 dimensions. That's the other trick that people developed in the turn of the century. And so that's the simple solution. You move K underneath E, so J equals E divided by the lead field, plus constraints that you have to put on the solution that was later discovered, because without the constraints, there's an infinite number of solutions to this inverse equation. So I won't go into all the details of the constraints, but we use the standard constraint with the Loretta, which was developed by Roberto Pascual Marquis around 1994. And that turned out to be more accurate than many of the other methods. And the handbook of quantitative EEG, both the ebook and the hard copy, go in great detail about that history, so you can read it. Now, standardized S-Loretta was developed by Roberto Pascual Marquis to deal with the problem of the problem that the brain is actually not spherical. It's shaped more like a loaf of bread. It's flat on the bottom and it's elongated. And so that's in the temporal lobes and the frontal lobes. They're flat. And so you get good source localization at NIH with any sources near the top where it's curved, it was really quite good. But temporal lobes and frontal lobes are off by 3 centimeters, 4 centimeters. To solve that problem, that using regular Loretta, Roberto Pascual Marquis would normalize it, all the sources. Essentially, he would take all the voxels, he would add them up, create an average, and then divide that into each of the voxels. And that's the standardization method. And that helped get rid of the discrepancy between a loaf of bread and a spherical head model. Now, it still wasn't perfect, but it improved it. And this is a chart that shows how S-Loretta and regular Loretta differ. If the signal to noise ratio is very high, like 25 to 1, there's no error in measurement using S-Loretta. Whereas regular Loretta will have 2 centimeters, 1 to 2 centimeters, no matter what the signal noise ratio is. So that's one of the advantages, and that's been tested. And there's other methods too that are all reviewed in the handbook. So the S-Loretta does give you a match with the geometry to a fairly great extent. And this book, or this paper by Songa et al. In the Journal of Neuroscience, they said with increasing accuracy of head conductivity models that match the individual subject, standardized methods may become defensible. Well, they clearly are defensible. But what we did at NIH is use what's called the spherical head model and the finite element method, the boundary element and boundary element and finite. Essentially, what the boundary element method is you don't use a sphere because the brain's not shaped like a sphere, as I mentioned. And instead, you look at the brain in an MRI and you get a mouse. And I used to do this, and you go around the whole boundary of the brain, the actual boundary of the brain. It's a real brain. It's a realistic brain model. And then you solve the inverse solution knowing the geometry, the real geometry of the brain, and not an artificial geometry like a sphere. And you immediately increase the accuracy tremendously. And so the boundary element method was, there's finite element, that's more complicated. We would have to send the data out to supercomputer at University of California, San Diego, and to University of Illinois. And it would take like 3 or 4 days before we get the results. Whereas the boundary element method, you calculate that in milliseconds. So everybody adopted the boundary element method. And in 2007, Ernesto Soler, who he got a bachelor's degree in physics and quantum mechanics, is his major, and it was his thesis. He came up with this other method. Essentially, it's called it's a weighted S Loretta. He has SW Loretta, but it's weighted S Loretta, in which if you use regular standardized Loretta on the left, you'll see that there's heterogeneity inside the skull. You've got gray matter, you got white matter, you have blood vessels, you have glial cells, you got a whole bunch of stuff in there. And that distorts the electricity. But magnetism, that space is invisible to magnetism. It goes right through everything and it doesn't make any difference. So magnetism has higher accuracy, better accuracy than electricity, but the problem is it's 1,800 times weaker. So Ernesto came up with this method using Roger Penrose inverse solution there that you see in the center, in which you can standardize the heterogeneous electric field so it becomes homogeneous, just like magnetism. So that's what SW Loretta does. And now it allows us to see the cerebellum, for example. We get really good localization. It's much more accurate than S Loretta. And deep sources can be imaged. And it's just as fast as S Loretta. So that's SW Loretta. There's a bunch of validations. I'm not going to go into these. All of this is available. You can download it and see these experiments validating the accuracy of SW Loretta. And these are publications. There's numerous publications using SW Loretta. And you get good accuracy. Here's an example of a study where you can look at deep sources. This is just another one. So if you do a search in the National Library of Medicine database, PubMed, you can get all the publications on SW Loretta, including simulations. And so this is one. This is one of many simulations of the accuracy of these dipole sources. We did many of these at the National Institutes of Health. This one was done at an institute in France that Ernesto was involved with. And essentially, the column on the left is where a dipole is simulated on the left and right of thalamus, deep, left thalamus, right thalamus. And that's this upper part you can see here. The column on the right maintains those two sources in the thalamus, but adds a source to the right occipital lobe. So it has 3 sources. Now we look at 19 channels, And you can see how well 19 channels localizes these sources from the surface, including this source in the lower right, the occipital lobe. Now, again, $5,000 for 19 channels. It's $125,000 for 128 channels, and it takes an hour to put them on. So it's not easy. But there's hardly any difference in the source localization accuracy between 19 channels and 128 channels. And that surprised me at NIH. I was a project manager for 128 channels, but we compared 19 to 32 to 48, 96, 128 to 56. We compared the accuracy. And there is some improvement in accuracy from 19 to 32, but it's not a lot. But beyond 32, there's virtually no improvement in accuracy. And so you don't have to, you'll hear people say, yeah, but you can't localize the sources with 19 channels. Well, that's just simply not true. There's hundreds of papers published using 19 channel source localization. And on our website, we actually cite, I think, 750 of these papers, publications, up till 2010. So beyond there's even more. And then, so you can see 128, not much improvement. And then if you got 148 channel magnetic encephalography, costing, several $1 million and having a big magnet, you do get an improvement, but not gigantic. And it turns out that the brain, because the size of Brodmann areas, you don't need millimeter spatial localization. The brain doesn't work that way. It works in large groups. So each of the Brodmann areas is made up of billions of neurons. And at any given moment of time, some of those neurons in a given Brodmann area are tied up with or doing other tasks, or they're refractory because they just were discharging, or they don't have enough blood supply or glucose and they're just kind of sleeping. But you have 5 billion, okay? So, and so at any moment of time in a given Brodmann area, it'll be a different set of billion that are shifting around inside your given Brodmann area. And so we are able to measure that, and we'll be showing this using phase slope index and also phase shift and phase lock. But we can see how the brain recruits neurons from at a given instant of time. The recruitment is about 25 milliseconds to 80 milliseconds. And we actually correlated that with the neuropsych tests, including IQ tests. And we found that and it's a shout out. It's saying, who's available? And so it's a phase shift. And it's brief, in less than 80 milliseconds usually. But the longer the duration of that shout out, the higher the IQ, because it recruits more neurons. And this is going on all the time in our brain. Now, once those neurons are recruited, saying who's available, then there's a gap of about 120 milliseconds, which is still a mystery. And then suddenly they become phase locked. And they stay phase locked for 250, 300 milliseconds. And the shorter the phase lock, the higher the IQ. So the phase shift recruits. The longer the period of the shout out is, the more neurons it recruits, the higher the IQ. But once the neurons are recruited, the brain's got to get its job done, be efficient, and then let that group of neurons go, and then do another shout out. Who's available? Lock them in for 300 milliseconds. And who's available? We get another group of 300 milliseconds. And this is going on all the time in the brain. Now, these are tests of the difference between S. Loretta and SW Loretta. It's in this particular, it's on your the thumb drive, this PowerPoint presentation. And now, one question is it possible to measure cerebellar sources? And people used to say, no, you can't. Well, if you do a search of the National Library of Medicine, type the search terms EEG and cerebellum, a year ago, there's 2,036 publications. So you can measure cerebellar sources from the scalp surface. There's no doubt about it. Okay, and then people don't believe it, but just do this search and you'll see. And an interesting thing about the cerebellum is that you can see the flocculus nodule that is the vestibular system related to balance and your orientation in space. And it's also in competition with the superior colliculus with your visual system. That's why if you go to Knott's Berry Farm in California or Disney, you can go in these rooms where everything's distorted and the floor is actually sloping, but you don't know it because you have your eyes open. As soon as you close your eyes, you'll fall down because your eyes, you believe your eyes, and your eyes are suppressing the vestibular system right here. So that's the difference. And also that's why you do this kind of test, with eyes open, eyes closed, balance. So you want to see how well you're able to connect up and your movement of the cerebellum. And one of the interesting things is the field of computational neuroanatomy, which was developed by Eric Schwartz at New York Medical College and NYU School of Medicine, in which he was able to show that by going into the literature that if, in this case, Talbot and Marshall and Daniel Witteridge in the 60s and those are completely independent studies, would flash lights to animals and people and then measure the connection, the part of the brain that was activated by the flashing lights on the disc of the retina. And so they could see that most of the vision happens in the fovea. Okay, so in the periphery, we have less detail. And so he drew out, Talbot Marshall did a graph, which was an exponential function and a logarithm. And so Eric had a PhD in physics, excellent mathematician. And he said, hey, Bob, look at this is an exponential function. The mapping of a disk to a rectangle is called a conformal map, discovered by Bernard Riemann in the 1800s. Now, when I was a math major for a couple of years at the University of Oregon, and I was introduced to that in one of my calculus courses. But in those days, what Riemann, all I knew about it was a way to help mariners navigate the world. So those days you'd have a big globe in the back of the boat, a sphere, and you would see where all the continents are. But Riemann was able to transform a sphere into a rectangle. So now you can put the whole Earth up on the wall. You'll see this if you go to the museum in San Francisco or New York. That's called a conformal map. We map a sphere or a circle to a rectangle. And so Eric looked at Talbot and Marshall's data and said, that's a conformal map. The retina is a disc, and look at it's mapping to a rectangle, which is the visual cortex. Now, there's huge computational advantage to that. You get size invariance, rotational invariance, a number of things because of the fact it's a logarithm. In mathematics, it's very important. And then if you look at the cochlea as a logarithmic spiral, the mapping of the skin, a straight line in the somatosensory cortex is a spiral around our limbs. So all our senses are going through this particular conformal transform, which is computational neuroanatomy. So a computer can't do this. Now, our brain weighs 2.5 pounds, 3 pounds. And it would take a computer the size of Rhode Island to even come close to what the brain does. Because the brain works by mapping. It's not like registers with zeros and ones, where you go into a central processor and you do multiplication, and then go back to different parts of the memory of the computer. This is done just by the anatomy itself. So instantly, as information is coming in through our eyes, size invariance, rotational invariance, color, all this stuff is happening instantly. So it's much faster. And similar, if you look at the cerebellum, you see the figure of where the body is mapping to the cerebellum, and you can see the hands are really big at the top there, and it's upside down. And the feet. Now the calves don't have much to do, so they're real small. The head is big because you got a lot of sensory information in your face. And so the size of that figure there depends upon how much, representation there is in the cerebellum. But notice that the lower part of the cerebellum is also a figure, but it's flipped 180 degrees, 90 degrees, and it's rotated and it's duplicated. This is the same thing that happens in a conformal map, essentially. You replicate by rotation, 90-degree rotation. That's the conformal maps do that. And so that's computational neuroanatomy itself, just by the way it's mapping to the cerebellum. So there's a lot of examples of this in the nervous system. And so Anderson et al., they wanted to see is EEG and MEG the same, or can we do can EEG be as good as MEG? And sure enough, they found that that the EEG sources could be used to look at the cerebellum, deep parts of the brain, and then so that expanded the use of SW Loretta, and this is one of the studies that Ernesto was involved with, but you can see the sources from the cerebellum in this study. So there's no doubt about the fact you can measure sources from the cerebellum. And then Samuelson et al., they wanted to really carefully look at the strength of the sources that are from the cortex at the top versus the cerebellum, which is deeply hidden, using electrodes at the scalp surface. And they found that they no problem in detecting sources from the cerebellum, but just they happen to be 30 to 60% weaker because it's a distance away from the scalp surface. But they compared MEG to EEG, and you can see the blue line is the cerebellum. But both EEG and MEG can detect sources from the cerebellum. They compared the dispersion and the various aspects of magnetic encephalography versus EEG. And again, MEG still, you need to be in a shielded room with liquid helium, and it costs $1 million. 3-ton magnet. And then they looked at the sources using MEG from the cerebellum, and that's the lower part, especially you can see the section right through the center of the cerebellum. And the strength of the sources is shown in the bar down there. The red one is a stronger strength. But all the sources could be detected, all these parts of the cerebellum. Then they compared that to EEG. EEG, too, can detect the sources. So here's EEG, here's MEG. EEG, MEG. So anybody, if you want, check out this publication. So there's no doubt that you can detect sources from the cerebellum, which is very important for us because, as I mentioned, it has 80 billion neurons. And it's very, very important part of our brain. It's hidden, but it has projections, particularly up to the cortex, particularly the ventral cortex, I mentioned. Whereas a dorsal cortex, motor cortex, is involved in where things are in space and moving your limbs, your hand to that location in space. The ventral system is related to, well, what is it? Like, yeah, it's okay to move your hand to that thing wherever it is, but you also want to know what is it. So that's your ventral system, and the cerebellum is connected to that. What is it part? But this is a conclusion that Samuelson has, is that there's no doubt that cerebellar sensitivity is sensitive. EEG can detect sources from the cerebellum. This is a study by Philippines et al. Looking at Parkinsonism. And on the upper left is a healthy motor system where the substantia nigra, which has dopamine, is communicating with the basal ganglia. And through the subthalamus, in thalamus, it's involved in movements, coordinated, smooth movements, not like Parkinson. The middle diagram shows where the substantia nigra is degenerated and it's not producing dopamine. Now you have Parkinsonism. And one of the interesting things is that the fine motor movements are in the sensory motor cortex there, but that's mostly our hands and our fingers. So the first thing that starts oscillating as Parkinson's develops is hand oscillations, jerky hands, but not so much your limbs. And for gross movements, swinging, walking, all that. That's because over the right, what's involved in these large movements is the cerebellum, which doesn't have any dopamine. Okay, just the substantia nigra has the dopamine. So you can actually move patients. If it progresses too far, then they'll have some problems. But so it's the fine motor movements that are affected most by Parkinsonism, and so the cerebellum is very important as a compensatory dynamic. And you can see here, and this is a study that Philippines did, where they lesion the red nucleus. The red nucleus is a relay nucleus from the cerebellum, one of them. It's very important. And the red nucleus projects up to the cortex and also down to your spinal cord. And the cerebellum is connected to the red nucleus. The red nucleus is this thing right here, which is also projecting to the thalamus.
Can you train this? Does neurofeedback change Parkinson's?
Yeah, that's what they did in this study. They actually, what they did is they had two groups of these are monkeys. One, they did not do the neurofeedback on one, but they degenerated the red nucleus in both of them, both groups. And one was a placebo control where they didn't do any EEG biofeedback. The other one is SMR biofeedback, same as what Barry Sturman did and Thompson in the history of neurofeedback back in the early 70s. And they found that the neurofeedback reduced the symptoms, significantly improved symptoms, whereas the placebo control did not. And they then sacrificed the monkeys and looked at the red nucleus, and they could see there's proliferation of synapses in the red nucleus with biofeedback, but not in the placebo.
What's the proposed, or what's known about the mechanisms of neuroplasticity within the cerebellum? Serotonin,
epinephrine, the same neuromodulators as other parts, but not dopamine.
But synaptogenesis and
Oh yeah, sure.
all of that.
All of that, yeah. I mean, if you play baseball, you got to learn how to swing the bat. At first, you're not really good at it, but you keep swinging, and you get better and better and better. That's your cerebellum and your basic
The
ganglia.
less you think about it, the better you get.
Absolutely, yeah, you do. You don't have time to think. You just suddenly have the ball in your glove, and you go, "Wow, where'd that come from?" That happens a lot to baseball players. And so we decided to expand NeuroGuide to evaluate the cerebellum and the sensory motor cortex. And this is the circuitry that's involved in Parkinsonism, for example. And that's what SW Loretta allows us to do. And we couldn't do that before. And so we wanted to evaluate that in more detail. And so one of the tests of cerebellar functioning is the Romberg test, and that's where the finger to the nose, okay? And the other is heel to shin. You move your heel, right heel down your left shin, and your left heel down your right shin. Those are just two of the Romberg tests. And so we developed SW Loretta. We had to create boundaries around the cerebellum, and that's the boundary that we used, because that's solution, remember the image of the balloon, and you got sensors on the outside of the balloon and sources in the interior of the balloon. You need to know the boundary of the balloon, the boundary element method. Otherwise, you can't solve that equation. And so here's a subject. We're doing nose. You'll see Sid tomorrow. You saw, anyway, he'll be here. Actually, we're measuring EEG while he's doing the Lomborg test. There's Sid and Emin. That's the heel to shin Lomborg test. And then we evaluated the EEG at the sources, and this is the inverse solution we got. Left finger to nose, the left cerebellum was the source. Right finger to nose, the right cerebellum was the source. And we would switch left and right and get good source localization. So there's no doubt about the fact that you can resolve sources, cerebellar sources from the scalp surface. And then we went further and we looked at coherence and lag coherence and phase differences in the phase slope index, which is information flow. And we looked at left hemisphere, right hemisphere, and then the coherence is diagonal. And what this is the number of t-tests for, first it's baseline EEG, you're not moving, and then you move. And there's no artifact in the record that you can see from the movement. When you go like this, we didn't have any artifact. But there's a big change if you compare the non-movement to the movement, and that's what this is. 70%, for example, of the measures were significantly different at 0.05, for example. 90% for lag coherence. Lag coherence gets rid of any possibility of volume conduction. So that first in a few milliseconds is wiped out. You don't look at that. Phase was weaker, but it was still significant, 40% change. And then phase slope index is also significant. So you can clearly get significant effects from a baseline EEG from the cerebellum compared to when you are doing a movement. And then we also looked at this in traumatic brain injury and found that there's a big difference in the cerebellar sources between severe traumatic brain injury and normals. And we also looked at the red line is moderate, the dashed red line is moderate TBI, and the dashed blue line is mild TBI. So you can see the more severe the traumatic brain injury, the greater the deviation from the reference normal group in the cerebellum. And so you'll be doing this with NeuroGuide. It's in the NeuroGuide demo. And you can go movies of this if you wish. And we'll be going through that a little bit later. So let's see if anybody has any questions, either people remote or here.
I have a question. I don't know if it's related, but I read somewhere that you talk about the brain cells, that 90% is the glia cells, which is not cells that transmit the signal. There's only 10% of neurons that transmit the signal in the brain, and the glia is more like, I don't know, not a filling, but
It's a lot of glial cells. They're very small. Yeah, the glial cells interface the blood and the brain. The brain itself, the neurons themselves, can't store glucose. Right? And but they're extremely energetic, particularly the pyramidal neurons. Mm-hmm. And so there's oxygen and glucose coming in from the blood supply that's then moved from the blood supply to the neurons via the glial cells. And waste products are taken away, metabolic waste products are removed and taken to the blood. Yeah, by the glial cells. So they're nursemaids. And they're also structural support.
Right.
Structural support, they're nursemaids feeding the neurons. The neurons are always, they need a lot of food. I mean, the brain only, like I mentioned, weighs only 2.5 to 3 pounds, but it consumes 20 to 40% of your blood glucose. Yeah. It's a hugely energetic little mass of tissue, and it's got to be fed.
And another thing, so what I read was the glial cells, they can multiply, but I don't know about the.
Glials, typically they don't. The cancerous glioma is where the glial cells multiply and they kill you.
Okay, they multiply instead.
So let me see what I got here.
I had a quick question about
Sure.
cerebellum. Since I've been doing some training with that, it's impacted the SMR frequency along the strip in a good way. It's motor movement and everything from just balance onto performance has really increased in people since I've been entering cerebellum and SMR training into it.
This is a training.
Is there a dynamic that the cerebellum will produce that kind of sensory motor rhythm to up to CZ or C4?
Yeah, the cerebellum does have rhythms somewhat, but the sensory motor is very specific to the dopaminergic projection to the sensory motor cortex that like Barry Sturman worked on.
Mm-hmm.
And it's you got alpha generators, which are at around 10 hertz. And then the SMR is a type of alpha rhythm, but it's in the sensory motor cortex, so slightly higher frequency. And it's just generally what is going on is you have to have readiness of neurons all the time, so they'll be available to be allocated to mediate some function. And so one of the dominant rhythms is around the 10 hertz range.
Mm-hmm.
In the limbic system, it's more in the theta band. But it's important to have it. Let me see if I can get to here and take a look at this is our website. I don't know what happened there. So I am connected to the website. So let me see. Trying to get my I don't know why I can't see the, let me try here. Here it is. I'm not connected to the Wi-Fi, I guess.
No, you're fine.
Huh.
Because I can see your screen while you're clicking around, so you're connected. Yeah, I see that.
Now this is our YouTube video library. I don't know why I'm having trouble. Well, I'm going to go through this briefly about editing. I don't know why I can't get all of them.
This is a tutorial of the NeuroGuide software.
Let me make sure
that
everybody
is
can hear
used
me.
to import EEG and evaluate that EEG, and especially powerful to be able to only select artifact-free data and reject artifact. Step one is to scan through the entire record. One must always visually scan every record before and after artifact rejection. In this case, I'm using the wiper at the bottom of the
Check and see if they can hear me.
NeuroGuide display,
Okay.
showing that there's 3 minutes and 48 seconds. There's some artifact near the end. I can click the home key to go home. I can click the end key to go to the end of the recording.
You what?
It's important to go to the end of the recording to determine
Is there,
the
I know
length
it's
of
a
the
little bit of
recording.
a
If
question,
it's
but
5
the difference
minutes, 10
between
minutes,
QEEG
20 or 30 minutes, the longer the
before you
recording,
edit
the
the
more
data.
likely there is
Um,
to find drowsiness.
No,
We're going to scan
this is
back through
conventional
the
EEG
record
here.
and identify
Because there's no spectral
artifact, make a
analysis.
mental note.
So,
Mental
and
notes are marked in
NeuroGuide is designed so you can
terms
have
of
both
eye movement artifact
conventional
in
EEG
3 minutes
and then
19
quantitative
seconds.
EEG at the
Overall,
same
the
screen at
record
the
is
same
quite
time.
clean.
But as soon as you do a
Scanning,
spectral analysis,
you
then
will
you
see
have
that there's
quantitative EEG.
artifact at 19
If you just
seconds.
use your
That's
eyeballs,
eye movement.
or, you know,
19
just
seconds,
eyeballs,
and
then
then
it's
it'll scan all the way
non-QEG.
back to
It's
home.
just EEG.
This is an individual
So
structure
eyeball
by
evaluation of
Barlow
the squiggles
by
is,
They're not hearing it
by
very
a
well.
region of his brain and skull.
let
by
me
a
then
rat,
do it
and he's
myself.
resulting in pathology and a gross
And we should probably take a
symmetry
break
with
anyway.
greater theta
Let's see.
rhythms in the right hemisphere than the left. Now let's select artifact-free data. Click Edit, Automatic Editing. The automatic edit window comes open. The left part of the panel is for the manual selection of a template of 10 seconds of data that does not have artifact. And then NeuroGuide will go
So what
through
we're gonna
the remainder of
do
the record and
is-
match one-to-one.
Take a break and then I will bring up NeuroGuide and we'll go through it here. Got plenty of these now. And so I'm going to pause recording for now, and we're going to take a 15-minute break.